Chief Executive. Today, we have our speaker, Gary Jones, Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Federation of Western Connecticut. His presentation will be on learning to recognize the diverse forms of anti-Semitism. The Jewish Federation is the home office and lead voice of the diverse Jewish communities residing in Western and Northwestern Connecticut. It works to further the welfare and advancement of the surrounding Jewish communities in Israel and overseas. Gary entered the nonprofit professional world 12 years ago when he became the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League Connecticut regional office. In that capacity, he oversaw the league's efforts to fight prejudice, monitor and expose extremist groups, promote civil rights, and build bridges of understanding among diverse groups within the region. Gary received his Bachelor of Arts from Brandeis University and his Juris Doctor from New York University. Today's presentation will focus on unusual manifestations of Jewish hatred. He will discuss the protocols of Zion and the unique benefits afforded the Jewish people by America, distinguishing between freedom of religion and freedom from hate. Israel will be discussed as a mechanism to promote hatred of Jews in a way that doesn't necessarily sound anti-Semitic, including the beginning of the effort to portray Israel as a manifestation of all that is hateful to progressives. I just want to thank, before we begin, Gary, Gloria and Marty Greenstein and the Renee Block Foundation for their continued support of the speaker series over the years. To Marion Dar, our genius who gets us on Zoom and continues to contribute the intelligence and wise thoughts to this program, and to Silke Berger, who gets the PR out to the community for us to share some fascinating speakers and information. Gary, you're on.
Thank you so much, Lois. Thank you, everybody. Some of you may remember I had the honor of participating in a Friday night service a number of months ago, but this, I hope you don't get too sick of me as a result of this long-winded presentation, but I do very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I appreciate what you all do. So first, as the professional leader of the Jewish Federation, I also want to thank the coalition for being such a good partner in our efforts to support the needs and promote the values of the Jewish community in Western and Northwestern Connecticut. It has been an honor to get to know Rabbi James Green. As you all know, he is both a humble and inspirational leader. I feel very lucky to consider him my friend. We were also delighted at the Federation to have had the opportunity to present Lois with the Federation's 2021 Habonim, or Builders Award, for all that she has done for the coalition. I see claps, I want to join in them. I also look forward to being able to present the award to her personally when COVID permits us to get together in person. So Marion and Lois suggested I just spend a very quick minute on the Federation. I won't add too much to what Lois said because she did give a really good broad overview of what we do. But I guess there are a few things I'd just like to say. The first is there are 7 Jewish federations in Connecticut. We are one of the smaller ones in terms of Jewish population and one of the larger ones in terms of the geographical area. So just so you have a sense, we essentially, our federation starts in Waterbury, goes through Southbury, Newtown, and down to Danbury, and then the entire northwest portion of our state. So we have a lot of small, diverse communities, and we really work hard at the Federation to try to do everything we can to both unite our community and support our constituent institutions. So I'll just give you one other minute on some of the things that we do. And I put my name, email address, and cell number in the chat. So feel free at any time to call if you want to learn more about the Federation, to give me some advice, tell me where we're wrong, or anything that you want to do. Feel free to call or write. But as I said, we try really hard to bring our community together and lift up our constituent organizations. We have 14 or so organizations in our federation area, and we believe it's our job to help them do their jobs better with their own particular constituencies. In doing so, we provide community-wide programs. Some of you have participated in the Women's Seder, in our campaign kickoff event, and I know a number of you participated in our Yom HaShoah program that we just had a few weeks ago. Obviously, one of the things the Federation does is it gives financial support to organizations throughout our communities. We support virtually all of the organizations who are providing education to our students. We give grants specifically to help them do that. That's one example. In addition to supporting Jewish community organizations, we recognize about 20 non-Jewish secular organizations who provide important help to all of the constituents of our region. Women's shelters, food pantries, and last year we actually contributed a very substantial amount of money to a program that was designed to help people who participated in fighting COVID, the workers and the healthcare providers who had financial trouble. We were able to support them in a meaningful way. We obviously engage in legislative advocacy to support Jewish values and to promote civil rights. We stand up for Israel. We combat anti-Semitism. As many of you know, we take a lead role in helping to secure the Jewish community. And one of the things we did over a year ago now is that we, with 3 other sister federations in Connecticut, we hired a regional security advisor to help support all of the synagogues, all of the schools, and everyone in our community to help make sure that they are up to speed in terms of protecting their buildings and protecting their people. And finally, we are here for any crisis. If there's a crisis in Israel, we take a lead role. As many of you know, federations take a lead role in the efforts of our people to support the individuals who are going through terrible trauma in Ukraine. In fact, you should know the federation system nationally has raised $60 million specifically to support refugees and other people suffering through the Ukraine scenario. And again, I see many of you on the call who have participated in that effort. So that's enough about federation, and we have some difficult ground to cover. So I'm going to turn to the specifics of anti-Semitism and the concerns that I think we're seeing today. So I'm going to try to accomplish 6 things in this talk. I'm going to try to provide insight into the various forms of anti-Semitism that we are seeing, both in our country and throughout the world. 2, to help us see that although anti-Semitism is diverse and comes from all parts of the political spectrum and can arise anew for almost any reason, there are certain commonalities that typically exist. 3, I'm hoping to enable us to be flexible and even mentally agile in recognizing emerging forms of anti-Semitism, especially anti-Semitism cloaked in hatred of Israel, in order to combat these manifestations of anti-Semitism more appropriately. 4, we're going to provide an analysis of the challenges facing our children and grandchildren on college campuses. And 5, we're going to provide some guidance on how we can understand and be more comfortable standing up for Israel. And finally, 6, I'm going to highlight a few of the risks contributing to the growth of anti-Semitism and to recommend a few tools to help fight the growth of anti-Semitism. So starting with my wife, Jill, who's here. Thank you, Jill. My wife, Jill, often says, only half jokingly, that most of what I know has come from watching the Three Stooges and Seinfeld. Although that is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, I do find that comedy often provides a unique and memorable way to understand important issues. But just to show that I also have learned a few things from Jill, I will start with a lesson I learned from her. Here is a scene that may have occasionally occurred in your house. I can confirm that it has certainly occurred on more than one occasion in mine. Jill asks me from time to time to look for something in a cabinet or a closet. Sometimes I find the item. However, there are times when I just don't see it. Yet Jill comes over and finds it immediately. I honestly thought that I had looked, but clearly I didn't do a very good job. When I apologize for not finding it, but reiterate the point that I did look, she notes, sometimes you need to move things around to find them. I had simply assumed that if something was there, I would automatically see it. That's not always true. I have been frustrated for a number of years about the fact that too many people who agree with me on so many issues couldn't see and were therefore not concerned about what was happening on college campuses and in some other progressive venues. People were being exposed to a hopelessly unfair portrayal of Israel, which often concluded that Israel is a racist, apartheid, and colonialist state. That unfair portrayal has often resulted in marginalization, intimidation, and isolation of those who dared to support Israel. This frightened me. Why did other smart and good people not seem concerned about this trend? A few months ago, before COVID struck, there was a meeting between Jewish leaders and our senators, our governor, and other really terrific public officials who wanted to show support for the Jewish community in the wake of a series of deadly attacks. As one after another spoke, it became clear to me that they all seemed to think that the threat of anti-Semitism came exclusively from right-wing extremists. What that said to me is that we as a Jewish community are not educating our political leaders well enough on the variety of the threats to the Jewish people. Starting right then and there, I decided that I would work hard to make it clear that anti-Semitism is not one size fits all. The history of anti-Semitism demonstrates that it morphs and can fit any political philosophy. History shows that Jews are often thought to represent and be responsible for whatever evil it was that affected the society at any given time. However, it was also clear to me why we weren't doing a proper job of educating our political leaders. Too many Jewish leaders themselves also didn't see the threat from the left. I've been at lectures and in discussions with highly placed and brilliant leaders representing important Jewish organizations who simply, when speaking of anti-Semitism, didn't mention the challenges posed by some progressives on college campuses, in NGOs, the UN, and some of the more liberal Protestant churches. It just didn't dawn on them that any of these issues could be a problem. It suddenly occurred to me that Jill's message about moving things around in a cabinet was also directly applicable to recognizing newer forms of anti-Semitism. We were so used to seeing anti-Semitism as principally a manifestation of right-wing extremism, like Nazism, that if it emanated from someone who was not identified with right-wing extremism, it must not really be anti-Semitism. The problem was further compounded because so many Jews in our country are, like me, progressive in so many ways. It didn't occur to them that folks who, in many instances, thought like them and voted like them could really be that unfair to Israel or a challenge to the Jewish future. Our brains like order. We tend to quickly separate people with whom we agree from people with whom we don't. As a result, we too often ignore or not even see that folks we agree with on so many issues could also be espousing blatantly anti-Semitic perspectives. Jill's reminder to me that sometimes you have to move things around in a cabinet to see them also applies to our minds. We have to be flexible enough and dedicated enough to move things around in our minds to find the truth, even when that truth sometimes hurts and poses a challenge to our normal way of thinking. So let's consider a few recent surveys of anti-Semitic incidents and a number of recent manifestations of anti-Semitism and consider how we got here. There are few Jewish people among us who don't recognize that we are experiencing many more examples of blatant forms of anti-Semitism in the past few years, both in our country and around the world. ADL statistics document a more than 20% rise in anti-Semitic incidents nationally from 2020 to 2021. In Connecticut, the rise during that same period was 47%. In New York City, documented anti-Semitic incidents have grown by more than 70% this year compared to the same period last year. AJC has noted that more than 33% of our college students experience anti-Semitism on campus. As a Jewish community, we've experienced the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the hostage taken in Colleyville, Texas, the recent string of terrorist attacks which have taken the lives of at least 19 Israelis, the recent Harvard Crimson editorial supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and the Palestinian liberation of Israel, the statement on Martin Luther King Day of this year by the head clerk of the Presbyterian Church, noting that all Jews are responsible for what he believes to be bad actions of Israel. The report of Amnesty International UK concluding that Israel is an apartheid state. The blowback experienced by Israel and Jews all over the world in social media and even in the streets of our country in response to Israel's efforts to defend itself from thousands of Hamas rockets last year, and the incidents at our very own state university in which the Yukon student government and the student newspaper sought to have the university punish Hillel for criticism of Hamas, the terrorist organization whose sole mission is to destroy Israel and kill Jews. The few examples I just cited forcefully demonstrate the diversity of the forms of anti-Semitism. It comes from extremists on the right, on the left, from Islamic terrorists, and from some groups who are not normally thought of as extremists, but who have adopted the hateful rhetoric of extremists when it comes to Jews in Israel. I won't spend a lot of time on the historical roots of anti-Semitism. However, it is important to know that some of the basic elements of historical anti-Semitism to understand what is occurring today. Although anti-Semitism is often referred to as the oldest form of hatred, we know for sure that Jews are by no means the only group subject to discrimination and hate. However, history is instructive in explaining why Jews have so often been singled out and why the singling out of Jews has often resulted in murder and not simple prejudice or disdain. The first thing about Jews historically is that we were different from the people around us. We stood out wherever we were in the world and wanted to continue to be Jewish wherever we were. We continued to be Jews no matter who conquered ancient Israel and no matter where we were dispersed once we were forced out of Israel. Minority groups who don't conform are a challenge under any circumstances. That's especially true for Jews, who in many instances have been the only identifiable cohesive minority group in otherwise homogeneous populations, as we were for hundreds of years in Europe. However, a new and very powerful element was working against Jews with the rise of Christianity. Remember that under church doctrine, Jews were responsible for the murder of Christ, the Son of God. And it was not just Jews who lived during the time of Jesus, it was all Jews who lived at any time thereafter. So, from a Christian perspective, Jews not only stood out and stubbornly refused to accept Jesus and God's true religion, we were all deemed equally responsible for the death of Jesus, no matter when or where we lived. Obviously, that's a pretty big burden. If Jews enjoyed no protection in God's eyes, why should people feel obligated to protect them? Thankfully, going forward a couple thousand years, in 1965, the Second Vatican Council rejected the deicide charge and took responsibility for contributing to the suffering of Jewish people for nearly 2 millennia. However, the teaching that all Jews were equally guilty of the death of Jesus set in motion a couple of themes that still challenge us today, even though, as I mentioned, most Christian churches have repudiated that doctrine. The first is the notion that all Jews everywhere are responsible for the perceived bad acts of Jews anywhere. The second related point is that Jews are deemed to be part of a conspiracy to harm the world. The perception that Jews are part of a conspiracy was a central element in European anti-Semitism for centuries and still continues throughout the world today, especially in certain Muslim-dominated regions. A few notable conspiracies that Jews were thought to conduct include the blood libel, in which Jews were said to kidnap Christian children to use their blood in the making of matzah. Jews were also deemed to have invented the Black Plague. Perhaps one of the biggest conspiracies said to be perpetuated by the Jews is represented by the Tsarist Russian work of fiction known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which was intended to document how Jews get together to discuss and implement their diabolical plans to cause the rest of the world to suffer. This single book was deemed to confirm the widely held perceptions about evil, conspiratorial, and the superhuman power of Jews. The Protocols is still popular on the internet and is believed to be true by many people throughout the world. Hamas specifically cites the Protocols as a reason that it attacks Israeli civilians. The belief on the part of people who hate Jews that Jews act together, have the ability and desire to harm the world was a common theme helping to explain numerous massacres, expulsions, and pogroms targeting Jewish people, and certainly contributed to the Holocaust. However, it is also a common theme in many of the recent attacks on Jews that I listed earlier. Here are a few examples. The right-wing terrorist who attacked the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh did so because he believes in the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. That conspiracy was also exhibited in Charlottesville in the Nazi marches in 2017, when white supremacists marched and chanted, "Jews will not replace us." The us being Christian white people. Interestingly, the concern of adherents to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is not that Jews will replace them with Jews, rather with minority groups. In the minds of adherents to this particular conspiracy, Jews conspired to change America and Europe to become a minority-dominated country, and they believe that Jews have the ability to make that happen. These replacement theorists clearly hate all minorities, as evidenced in their horrific attack on Black people in the Buffalo supermarket just last weekend. However, the Jew is clearly the biggest problem because only the Jew can manipulate others to do their bidding and cause the replacement to occur. That point is further illustrated by how much this hateful person who shot up the supermarket in Buffalo devoted to Jews in his personal manifesto. In addition, Islamic terrorists who took hostages in Colleyville hoped to gain the release of an Islamic terrorist held in a nearby federal prison. Why did he choose to take Jews hostage? Because he believed that Jews controlled our government and could therefore cause the release of the hostage. Cause the release of the prisoner. A baseless belief in that kind of Jewish control and manipulation is standard fare for folks who believe in Jewish conspiracy theories. They never thought to think that if we Jews actually had such power, then perhaps we would have used it to stop centuries of Jewish suffering and prevented the Holocaust. Other recent conspiracies for which Jews are blamed include the COVID pandemic, along with mask and vaccine mandates, and the 9/11 attacks. Opinion polls have shown that large percentages of people in the Muslim world continue to believe that Jews caused the September 11th attacks. And they know that to be true because they believe 40,000 Jews who worked in the towers stayed home that day. These conspiracy theories sound crazy to us. However, their ongoing vitality reminds us that hate is not logical. It is a belief system that feeds on itself. In addition, it helps to explain why it is so easy for people to hate Jews for diverse and at times fully inconsistent reasons. I think it's worth spending a few minutes on the Jewish experience in America. The truth is that overall, the Jewish community in the United States has been blessed. It starts with our constitutional safeguard ensuring freedom of religion. That promise was further articulated by President George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. That letter is worthy of a full discussion, and I recommend that you take a look at it when you can. That letter confirmed a radically new understanding of religious freedom. In America, one could be Jewish and still be an American citizen and have all the blessings of all the benefits associated with citizenship. There is no inherent conflict, so there was no need to choose Jewishness or Americanness over the other. As a result, Jewish people and other religious minorities have had an unprecedented religious freedom and liberty. Jewish Americans thrived as individuals and as a community. However, it became clear that freedom of religion and freedom to pursue opportunity did not guarantee freedom from hate and discrimination. There was always anti-Semitism in the United States. Christian doctrine continued to be a source of problems for Jews, and the conspiracy theories claiming that Jews are not loyal to our country and manipulate others attracted anti-Semites in America. Anti-Semitism reached a fever pitch in the United States before World War II, with Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, and others blaming Jews for all kinds of conspiratorial things, and including the conspiracy of trying to get the US involved in a war that normal Americans wanted no part of. After World War II, however, things changed markedly. Revulsion over Nazism and the Holocaust helped Americans to understand the devastating consequences of Jew hatred and were repulsed by it. In addition, the Catholic Church's reversal of its position on deicide also enabled many Christians to put hatred in the past. Anti-Semitism never disappeared in our country. Of course, ADL surveys always showed that there were at least 12% of Americans continued to harbor anti-Semitic sentiments. And of course, that's a lot of people. However, it clearly became unfashionable to demonstrate anti-Semitism publicly or in polite company. After the war, to a large degree, hatred of Jews was frowned upon. That largely continued to be true for many years. In fact, as you may remember, when Joe Lieberman ran for vice president in the year 2000, we were all amazed at how little controversy there was. In the last 20 years or so, the reticence to voice anti-Semitic ideas has begun to break down. My former boss at ADL, Abe Foxman, has attributed that breakdown to the fading of the Holocaust from memory, and with it, a fading reluctance to demonize Jews. I certainly agree that that is one element. That, by the way, is one reason that Connecticut and in another number of states, there has been an effort on the part of the Jewish community and others to mandate Holocaust and genocide studies into public school curriculum. However, I believe that there are other factors contributing to the growing comfort of people to express their hatred in a more public way. First, with the advent of the internet, social media, and the ability to get information from virtually any source anywhere, people who have chosen to hate are much less concerned with what a majority of people may think or even what their family members think. Instead, they are focused on what their particular influencer and narrow group of adherents believe. In the modern world, hateful people can reach out to virtually anyone throughout the world to preach hate or to promote terrorism. Like-minded people now have the ability to create their own communities of hate, even without ever seeing one another in person. And they don't care that anyone else may have a negative attitude of their hatred, as we saw with the Buffalo shooter in his manifesto. Second, some elements in our culture are beginning to become less interested in dialogue and nuance. Instead, they are trying to rely on strict boundaries between who is good and who is bad, and what is good and what is bad. We are witnessing this retreat from reason, unfortunately, in many progressive circles, and it's becoming evident, particularly on some college campuses. As I noted earlier, anti-Semitism has the uncanny ability to coalesce around whatever issue is deemed to be the biggest threat of the time. In the Middle Ages, it might have been the fear of the Black Death. Prior to World War II, capitalist anti-Semites labeled Jews as communists, and communist anti-Semites considered Jews to be capitalists. Today, in some progressive circles, and in others as well, the biggest threat to the world are colonialism, racial oppression, and others by white people, and apartheid. Too many modern-day progressive anti-Semites are beginning to label Israel and all Jews who do not disavow Israel as racist, colonialists, and oppressors. And they are not interested in honest dialogue that may demonstrate that these notions are inaccurate. Their perspective is true because they say it is true. And if you don't agree with them, you are part of the problem. The third and final point I view as contributing to the increase in anti-Semitism is the unreasoned hatred for Israel. What started as principally a Muslim and Arab-dominated effort to destroy and delegitimize Israel by any means possible was later supported with very unfortunate results by the Soviet Union in its effort to curry favor with Middle Eastern nations. Remember the anti-Semitic resolution passed in 1975 by the UN General Assembly that said Zionism equals racism? That canard was developed and propagated by the Soviet Union about 70 years or so after the Tsarist Russians concocted the protocols. Even though the UN later renounced the resolution, the value of trying to tie Israel in with racism and other hated conditions like apartheid, colonialism, and oppression has, very unfortunately, continued with truly horrible consequences. As a result, the efforts to tar Israel as emblematic of all that is evil in the modern world has grown to include many sympathizers in Europe and America, especially in what we normally consider to be progressive strongholds. This effort to gain the support of progressives to the side of those who want to destroy Israel are beginning to become clear to a greater number of Jews and others who support Israel. But there are still many who haven't fully understood this. Unfortunately, not enough members of the Jewish community saw this effort to mislead progressives to believe that Israel was the problem as it was developing, when perhaps it would have been easier to counter. Sometimes people just can't see what they don't want to see, and sometimes, as noted above, their preconceptions make it difficult to accept that notion that progressive people could be espousing anti-Semitic views in their hostility to Israel. Now, I'd like to remind us how, despite its efforts, Israel was never able to achieve peace with its Palestinian neighbors, despite the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. Although full and final peace between Israel and all of its neighbors doesn't appear to be likely anytime soon, it was not too long ago that many of us had a much more optimistic perspective. Let's go back to 1999 and early in 2000. As you may remember, President Clinton was working very hard to construct a peace between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Prime Minister Ehud Barak seemed to be committed to arranging a deal and to make concessions necessary to achieve that deal. Even Yasser Arafat seemed to be committed to the process. In fact, President Clinton seemed assured of having the problem resolved before he completed his term in office in January of 2001. Unfortunately, at the 11th hour, Chairman Arafat rejected the deal out of hand without even making an effort to negotiate further concessions. The American negotiators and the Israeli negotiators were stunned by the turn of events. Despite the frantic efforts of the president, there would be no deal. There was no doubt as to which side was the problem. To paraphrase President Clinton, Arafat rejected the peace of the brave. All of this came as a huge surprise to most of us in the American Jewish community. We really thought that peace would soon be at hand and that both Israel and the Palestinians would be able to enjoy the fruits of that peace. This history is important because it serves as a constant reminder that Israel has in 2000 and in a number of previous and subsequent occasions tried to settle the disputes once and for all. On the other hand, we are reminded the Palestinians, at least now, don't seem interested in compromise. I remind us of the history of this rejection of the peace process for another reason also. It was the first signal of a number that would follow in 2000 and 2001, indicating that Palestinians and perhaps other regional nation states and terrorist organizations really were not at all interested in peace with Israel and would find new ways to fight the war against Israel. There were 4 subsequent incidents that confirmed to me that Israel's problem with Palestinians and some of its neighbors were not likely to be resolved soon. Together, to use Jill's analogy of moving things around in a cabinet, these incidents forced me to rearrange my thinking and caused me to be on guard for the kind of unreasoned hatred and dehumanization that Israel would experience and continues to experience today. Here are the scenarios that I'm referencing. The first was the Second Intifada. As you will recall, almost immediately after Arafat rejected the peace process, suicide bombers were coming in waves to Israel, slaughtering hundreds. It was as if the suicide bombers were sent on cue. As a reminder, it is this wave of murders that resulted in the construction of the separation barrier between Israel and parts of the West Bank. That barrier, constructed to save Israelis from mass murder, is now referred to as the apartheid wall by Israel haters. The second thing that really got my attention is the Durban Conference on World Racism. This long-scheduled conference, held in the summer of 2001, was attended by ADL and other Jewish and American organizations for the purposes of highlighting real incidents of hate and discrimination that unfortunately continue to afflict our world. Amazingly and shockingly, the conference devolved immediately into an anti-Semitic hate fest in which no other problems existed in the world except for those caused by the Jewish state. It was absolutely shocking at the time, but it now serves to illustrate the manual of the United Nations and others who routinely now focus almost exclusively on the perceived sins of Israel and use progressive terminology to paint a hopelessly unfair portrait of Israel. The third incident was 9/11. The terror attacks showed us the depth of the hatred in parts of the world and that there was really no limit to how that hate would be manifested. Everyone, anywhere is an acceptable target. The fourth and final incident that I want to refer to is the response to 9/11 on many college campuses. ADL, like everyone else, was devastated by the attacks. However, as a civil rights organization, our job was to make sure that Muslims were not victimized in our country because of the actions of the terrorists. If we speak out against collective guilt and retaliation against Jews, we also had to be clear that it is equally wrong to do that to the Muslim community. As a result, we were happy to see that a number of Connecticut colleges and universities were sponsoring programs on matters like understanding Islam. However, it soon became clear that some of the programs, not all, but some, included an effort to blame Israel for the 9/11 attacks. The message was that if the US wanted to be safe, it needed to abandon its support for Israel. The point is that it became clear to me that it would be a while before Israel could achieve peace, that horribly untrue canards about Israel would become commonplace, and that the haters of Israel seemed to be targeting colleges, the UN, and other progressive strongholds in the effort to convince others that Israel should be a pariah state and excluded from the family of nations. Unfortunately, the drumbeat of anti-Israel sentiment on college campuses and in other progressive spaces has grown, and in fact, so pervasive that there is barely an effort to stand up for Israel in many of these spaces. At last year's Federation Yom HaShoah program, I spoke about the isolation and intimidation that Jewish students and others who support Israel feel on some college campuses. They are often forced into silence because retribution would otherwise follow. The fact that students do not feel comfortable coming out for Israel is in itself anti-Semitism, and it is compounded by the isolation and retribution that many experience. I was the interim Hillel director at UConn from the fall of 2019 through the summer of 2020. At that time, UConn was considered to be a quiet school in that it didn't regularly experience the kind of ongoing anti-Israel activity that is part of so many other colleges and universities. As a result, it was thought to be a comfortable place for Jewish students. However, I learned that the full truth was more complicated and not so pleasant. Even very knowledgeable supporters of Israel made it clear to me that they would not be comfortable showing support for Israel in the classroom or in other public venues. They acknowledged that the pervasive sentiment on campus is that Israel is the big bully picking on poor Palestinians. I think it is important to note here that everyone who thinks that Israel is a bully and is engaged in inappropriate policies does not necessarily hate Israel or believe that it should not exist. Many have not even thought about it. However, the people on campus who push the anti-Israel negative, like Students for Justice in Palestine and many faculty organizations, are clear that Israel should not exist and have no compunction in lying or taking other unfair action to convince people that Israel is a racist, hateful state. Similarly, the leaders of the BDS movement internationally have been very honest about the fact that the goal of the movement is dismantling Israel altogether. Their purpose is not an effort to change Israel's policy. Their purpose is to destroy Israel. In truth, there's nothing Israel can do to cause the haters to change their opinion. Unfortunately, the situation has become even worse in UConn in the last 2 years since I've been gone. Students for Justice in Palestine has become much more active and regularly paints Israel as an evil state whose soldiers kill Palestinian babies. It's sort of a modern variation on the blood libel I discussed earlier. The effort of Jewish students to correct that record was branded as Islamophobia in an unusually cruel form of irony. Finally, the interim president of UConn was harshly criticized for going to Israel as part of a trade mission with Governor Lamont. Israel is deemed to be so bad that good and decent people should know to stay away. The Boston Globe chronicled this intimidation and fear of Israel supporters on college campuses, including UConn, in an article published just last Sunday. The problems on college campuses are not confined to bullying and mistreatment of Jewish students. If the blatant hatred of Israel continues to go unchecked, we will be raising generations of college students who have been given little choice but to believe that Israel is the bad guy because they barely hear a contrary perspective. Over time, that will inevitably impact the ability and desire of the United States to support Israel. Israel has enough problems with genocidal nations and organizations like Iran, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, just to name a few. As American Jews, we cannot let our country lose sight of why Israel needs and deserves American support. So now I'd like to spend just a few seconds helping us to feel more comfortable being advocates for Israel. I hear more and more that Israel has become a divisive issue among American Jews. Sometimes when one hears the same thing over and over, it somehow becomes true. With proper analysis, I think we can demonstrate that basic support for a safe and secure Israel is not really a divisive issue among the vast majority of American Jews. That's not to say we won't disagree with Israel sometimes or won't feel obligated to criticize Israel from time to time. Just like Israelis themselves disagree with actions and policies of the government, we have and will continue to do that as well, just like we do to our American government. What we American Jews need to do is recognize a few basic points. Israel has been and continues to be essential to the Jewish future. It deserves to thrive as a Jewish democratic state with safe and secure borders. And it is our responsibility to support Israel and work to encourage the US and Americans generally to support Israel against those who want Israel either physically annihilated or taken apart. I don't think these points are controversial, and I believe that the vast majority of American Jews would agree with these principles. So we've spent a good time showing the reasons that anti-Semitism in so many forms is rising. However, particularly in this field we face. First of all, the vast majority of US citizens are not anti-Semitic and are clearly appalled by anti-Semitic actions. Just as important to help the Jewish community and others to ensure that our institutions have the financial resources necessary to protect our people. We cannot have a thriving and joyful Jewish community if our people feel unsafe. That is why Federation, together with 3 sister federations, have hired the regional security expert I mentioned before to advise all of our constituent organizations. In terms of American support for Israel, even though we have concerns about the future, at this point, there really is no doubt that congressional support for Israel is strongly bipartisan. Only 9 representatives out of 435 voted against Iron Dome funding, as an example. Similarly, among the general public, opinion polls continue to show that Americans support Israel. Finally, with all the concerns that we have with genocidal ambitions of Iran and the various terrorist groups, the peace treaties with Arab nations resulting from the Abraham Accords are a significant breakthrough in the effort of Israel to live in peace with its neighbors. And we have reason to be optimistic that other Arab nations may follow suit and sign peace treaties with Israel. This is really an important piece of good news in the middle of all the other difficulties in the Middle East. Coming back to the US, as noted, our governmental leaders at all levels are devoted to our protection as well. I would specifically like to remind us of the blessings that we have with our country's law enforcement leadership. Sometimes I believe that we do not appreciate the level of that support and the uniqueness of that support when viewed in the historical context. For our history in the diaspora, when Jews were subject to pogroms, forced dislocations, and other violent actions, the police and law enforcement agencies were often the perpetrators of the violent actions blessed by the government. At other times, they looked the other way and allowed the violent actions of others to continue unchecked. But they certainly didn't help us. In our country, law enforcement officials are clearly on our side. In fact, from my experience at ADL, I can tell you that the FBI, the state police, and other law enforcement agencies are more concerned about our safety than many of us are. That's a factor of 2 points, I believe. First, they take their job seriously. And second, they see information on threats to the Jewish community that most of us never know about. So please do not undervalue the benefit of law enforcement support. Other good news is that there are many good Jewish organizations working to protect and empower Jewish students on college campuses, and the rest of us as well. I would be happy to discuss some of them in the question and answer session if you would like. So what can we do to fight anti-Semitism generally and especially on college campuses? What can we do to prepare and empower Jewish students? What can we do to make sure that Jewish and Israeli narratives are not eliminated? First, we need to always educate ourselves. We need to be proud Jews and comfortable supporting Israel in order for us to stand up for ourselves and to help Israel. We have to understand why Israel is important to the Jewish narrative and to our future. But that doesn't mean that one has to know everything about Judaism or to be an expert in the long-standing dispute between Israel and its neighbors. Simply knowing that Israel is a thriving democracy whose government includes an Islamic party is a start. Remember, too, that it is Israel who has sought and will continue to pursue peace and reconciliation with Palestinians and its neighbors. The terrorist groups in neighboring states who hate Israel want neither peace nor reconciliation. They want there to be no Israel and are engaging in military and other efforts to make sure that Israel will perish. Finally, remember that leaders of the BDS movement have been really clear as well. Their movement is not designed to impact Israel's behavior. It is designed to result in the elimination of Israel. Second, we must also prepare our students for anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity long before they get to college campuses. Through my experience at ADL and Hillel, I can tell you that we have many brave and comfortable Jewish students on campus. They will make wonderful Jewish leaders for the rest of their lives. However, too many of our young people are not prepared for the challenges they will face to their values, identity, and to their heritage. What they experience on many college campuses is not fair, but we can help make it easier for them if they know what to expect, are comfortable in their own skin, and know the resources that are available to them. Our Jewish community must invest in this effort. We owe it to our students and to our Jewish future. Third, we must educate campus administrators to be more focused on protecting Jewish students. University administrators must take a greater responsibility for the well-being and safety of Jewish students on campus. Most universities have diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, very often headed by a senior administrator. Most, however, do not include Jewish students in those initiatives. Jewish people are not traditionally seen as a minority who is subject to exclusion or discrimination. We know that in the current environment, Jewish students are often subject to anti-Semitism, exclusion, and discrimination. We need to make sure that campus administrators adjust to the reality of campus life today. Fourth, we need to encourage university administrators to exercise their own freedom of speech. Many hateful, unfair, and inaccurate statements are made about Israel and sometimes about Jews themselves on some college campuses. When these statements go unchallenged, most students simply believe them to be true. However, the story can be quite different if the university president corrects the record and stands for the truth. Fifth, to empower university administrators, we must educate them. We can help them understand when anti-Israel sentiment crosses the line into anti-Semitism. The good news is that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, an alliance comprised of more than 30 nations, has adopted a definition along with examples of anti-Semitism. The IRA definition can be a very helpful way for campuses and for other venues to help people distinguish between criticism and anti-Semitic hatred. 6, we need to stand up for discourse and free exchange of ideas on college campuses and elsewhere. Where there are efforts to shut down or punish opposing opinions, democracy suffers and Jewish people do not do well. Similarly, perspectives that suggest that race or skin color are determinative of right and wrong and whose opinion matters close off discussion and efforts to learn from one another. Jews historically tend to be excluded from the favored groups, no matter who makes the determination of who is favored. As we know, white racists do not consider us to be white, and too often those on the progressive end of the spectrum do consider us to be white. Despite the fact that we know that there are many Jews of color in our country and certainly around the world. We are also considered to be privileged, despite the history of discrimination against and suffering of our people. Interestingly, as most of us know, most of Israel's Jewish population consists of people who came from Northern Africa and the Middle East and would be considered people of color if they lived anywhere but Israel. However, those who hate Israel often view Israelis, all Israelis, to be white, colonialist interlopers. In short, anytime extremists divvy up favored groups from non-favored groups, we tend to get the short end of the stick. We do better in an environment where there are no favorites and where we are all working together with everyone to build a freer and fairer nation, one which minimizes support for extremism on all sides of the political spectrum.
Thank
7,
you. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Gary.
We need to reach out to friends and allies, including elected officials, about how we feel and be clear about our concerns. Our friends cannot help us if we are afraid of sharing our deepest concerns. So I would like to close with a reminder of our sage Hillel's 3-pronged marching order for how to be a good Jewish person. Hillel said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? Many of us are very familiar with this injunction, and most of us try to live by it, even if we are not familiar with Hillel. In fact, Jews are almost always in the forefront in terms of showing support for victims of hate or anyone else who is suffering. We are the people of Tikkun Olam, and we know that obligation is to improve the world for the benefit of all humanity, not just ourselves. Sometimes I think, however, that many of us are so properly focused on the second prong, if I am only for myself, what am I, that we don't pay enough attention to the first prong. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? So my request to all of us in the Jewish community is that while we continue to pursue the obligation to help others, we also have to make sure that we fulfill our obligation to protect ourselves. At this difficult time in our history, we have a special duty to honor the first of Hillel's marching orders. And if it's not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. I think we know a lot of this stuff, and you've brought it certainly to our minds again. I want to thank you for that and ask if there are any questions from the group. Gloria, you can start.
Unmute. Gary, thank you. One of the things that always seemed very hypocritical to me, and I wonder to what extent you think it exists, is Jews who are racists. I think years ago, maybe that was more prevalent with our grandparents and parents, but it always seemed really so counterproductive and awful to me. Is it alive and well, or am I just remembering?
Well, I mean, listen, Jews are people too. And even though we like to think we ought to know better, and we should know better just by virtue of our own experiences, there clearly are some Jewish racists. surveys show, thankfully, a much smaller percentage than in many other groups, but they still are there. And, it's one of the things that I think is important for us to always keep in mind. And I had a discussion, I spoke before when I was at Hillel, I spoke before the African American Cultural Center's annual celebration, and highlighting the historic work between Jews and Black people to support one another. One of the things I think we have to remember is that hate thrives when it is not confronted. We always need to confront hate. If God forbid a Jewish person says a racist thing, we need to confront it, and we need to say, that's not who we stand for.
Right.
And I just don't want to hear that anymore. If every community would do that within their community, making it clear that they're not going to put up with that kind of hate, I think we'd all be better off. But Gloria, I share your perspective. It's particularly frustrating when a Jewish person, because we should know better, and we do all feel responsible for what each other does. But I don't think it's widespread. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and that certainly doesn't mean that we should let it go. We have to confront it.
Okay, I'll take not widespread for now. Yeah.
Brianna?
Hi, Gary. First of all, I want to thank you. I know you so well from the Federation, and that's one of the reasons I came, because I admire you so much, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Brian.
Gary, parts of your talk were very dismal to me in view of the way things are going downhill now, the way Israel is looked at. And I'll get to the point. I recently attended a seminar on J Street. Have you heard of that organization?
Sure.
It's mainly composed of college students, and Coburn, someone in Cheshire who follows Johanna Hayes, had this seminar on J Street. I didn't know what J Street was, but they told me that they got the name J Street. In Washington, D.C., the streets are named after all the letters, but they left out J. So J probably is for Judaism, and they got this organization. And Johanna Hayes is a representative you probably know from Connecticut, and she was asked to go to Israel, and it was a paid for a trip. It was also sponsored. Israel paid, and then a place paid, and she came back and made a decision against Israel as far as the way they're treating the Arabs, and is going for a two-state solution. I found it to be very disturbing, and mainly I saw the students, as you said, like at UConn, they're starting to take a view of Israel that is not right. I mean, I wrote back and forth with Marty Coburn, because I know him very well, and I said, why don't students take up things like what's happening in the United States instead of going after Israel? Why don't they take up gun control and other things that are more urgently needed in our country? But why are they going against Israel? And I know I have a lot of family there, and I don't think, and I'm very conservative in my views personally, as you probably know, and I'm not for the two-state solution. I think it would be very dangerous for Israel, especially right now. So what can we do about people like Johanna Hayes, and she comes out against Israel and takes money to go there, and still speaks out against the apartheid and the Palestinians, and I find it very dangerous, and I find it very
So
scary.
Brian, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
The thing that I would say is, especially with respect to Representative Hayes, she's new, she's learning, and my limited experience with her is that I think overall we can be very comfortable with her. She has supported all of the major bills where monetary support and in other areas for Israel. So I don't share the perspective, at least at this point, that she is a problem. In fact, one of the things we're encouraging her to do, and she went on an APAC mission as well. So
Right.
she is learning, and I think she's a very good person, and I think she is fine, and I think over time she may even understand it a little bit better. One of the things that I've been trying to work on doing is there is a sort of nascent Black Jewish coalition that's being formed in the House, and we're encouraging her to get involved in that initiative, just so she'll have more relationships with some of the Jewish members of Congress. But again, I think she's a really decent person, and I think I think she's really beginning to get the Jewish community, and I don't think that's a concern. Now, if something happens, I'll make sure this group knows that where I was wrong, but I don't think we need to be worried about that. I think there's a lot of growth there, and
Okay.
I think she's a good person.
Thank you.
Mr. Hertz?
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I'm Jonathan Hertz. My wife Marjorie and I are new in the area. We moved to Middlebury 4 months ago.
Nice.
And delighted to be here.
Welcome.
But I had a question for Gary. I was very interested in your description of replacement theory. And my question is specifically regarding Fox News. The New York Times earlier this month had an extensive 3-part series on the Tucker Carlson show, going through his history and carefully examining the content of his show over recent years. And they found that as many as 400 episodes dealt with theories or facts relating to replacement theory. Early this year, Jonathan Greenblatt, after a particularly explicit episode, recommended that Fox fire Sean Hannity over his description of replacement theory. Only 3 million Americans watch Tucker Carlson, but his show obviously creeps into social media and goes viral. Replacement theories is really is a threat with anti-Semitism. I'm just wondering how much of a problem you think this is.
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, I don't watch a lot of the cable news outlet. Sometimes I feel that they're so more involved in trying to get an extra 2,000 people that a lot of people will say things that are not moderate or appropriate. So I don't want to pretend I'm an expert on the Tucker Carlson situation, but I do think that I do think people are beginning to understand replacement theory and the threats associated with replacement theory more than they did in the past. And I'm hopeful the result will be whatever bad things that they may have done in the past, that there will be pressure to make sure that they don't continue even ignorantly showing support for kinds of hateful philosophies and hateful scenarios. And I think what we need to do is to be on the lookout for this. And certainly Jonathan Greenblatt is, just to make sure folks know, he's the new head of ADLs after Abe Foxman retired. And so he certainly does spend a lot of time and a lot of people monitoring these things. And as I said earlier, we got to call out bad behavior. We got to make people pay consequences for bad behavior. And we got to let people know when it occurs. So thank you, for making me more aware of that than I will. And I'll see if I can find anything else, but I'm hopeful, as I said, that that will be less of a trend, given the fact that people understand the consequences of this a lot more.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mal? Mal, you have your hand up? Okay, Richard. Mal, I thought you had your hand up.
I don't even have my video on.
Okay, so you don't have a question?
No.
Okay, Richard?
Okay,
Richard?
So Richard is offered me the next question,
Okay,
which is, Gary, so what if Elon Musk goes on to take the helm of Twitter?
Not gonna happen, probably.
You don't have questions. If he should, what's going to happen?
What would he do?
Well, you know,
Now you need to mute.
yeah, Mal, yeah, thank you.
that's a complicated question, Marion and Richard. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I know that one of the challenges for folks who worry about hate has been for a long time that our social media networks have never done enough to monitor hate and to try to keep it from spreading. As I said, they're just uniquely good platforms for these kinds of things. So right now, Twitter is a problem in terms of the gathering of people to promote hate. Many of the others are as well. So I don't know if Musk takes control, what, if any, implication there's going to be for that, to be honest. But I think as a general principle, we have to make sure that people take accountability for their platforms and monitor to make sure that the hate speech that results in murder and all kinds of terrible incriminations aren't given a free platform in these kinds of settings. So that's what I'm more focused on, but I don't know enough, I'm sorry, Marion, about Musk to know whether it's going to be a real challenge. It's going to be even a deeper challenge than it is now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the nice talk on this important subject.
Thank you, Marion.
Richard,
Oh, you're muted, Richard.
you're muted. I have a question while Richard's looking.
He needs
know,
a technical expert too, Lois.
Has there ever been a score taken on what group is hated most besides the Jews, the Asians, the Blacks?
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
not, okay. It's not close, unfortunately. The more African Americans are subject to hate crimes than any other group. Of course, there are more African Americans. Opinion polls show that there's a higher percentage people may have a negative perspective about Black people. So we can't lose sight of these things, and we can't lose sight of our obligation to support Black people and everyone else for that matter. However, what I would say though is that if you ask the random person, what is the likely percentage of someone of a particular group to be targeted by hate? Some people would say Muslims. Some people would say Black people. The unfortunate answer is that between twice and 2.5 Jewish people are between twice and 2.5 more times likely to be subject to a hate crime than either Black people or Muslim people. In fact, and there's a lot of stats and a lot of things but I took enough of your time already, so I didn't want to keep adding into it. But FBI does keep hate crime statistics on a yearly basis, where I talked about with the ADL surveys and of their records. But the federal government under the FBI does that too. Of all the religious-based hate crimes on a yearly basis, almost every year, this is not new, this has been going on forever, almost every year, about 60% of hate crimes based on religion target Jews. And so that's something a lot of people don't know. And the FBI knows it, and the federal government knows it, which is one of the reasons we're having the chance to get some money to help secure our institutions. But, you know, there's no hierarchy of hate. Hate is bad, no matter who is who is targeted, and it's our job to fight all hate of all kinds. However, in terms of the people who were afflicted by the consequences of hate crimes, in the religious setting, there's no question, we, as I said, Muslim people are targeted too, but we're targeted more than twice as many as Muslim people are.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Richard, and then Gloria. Richard?
Yes. I almost don't know where to start. I find like I've had problems with well, let me just say that there's such liberal bias that in this country and in this group and in our ethnic group that is fueling a lot of the anti-Semitism. I'm not blaming the victim. I will mention several points. Number one, nowhere, well, I'll just say that the 100th anniversary of the League of Nations mandate for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and that's the name of the mandate. The League of Nations British mandate for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The 100th anniversary passed last July, and what did the Jewish community do about celebrating? What's the importance of that mandate? That mandate is the international foundation, for the right of Israel to exist. And if Jews are too stupid to celebrate what gives Israel its legitimacy, and I brought this up to this congregation repeatedly, and what did this congregation do? What did our religious rabbi do? Okay, I'll just say one other thing. The wording that this community uses is bad against itself. To use the term settlement, I've mentioned this repeatedly, it's a resettlement or a resettlement, and if people don't understand the difference, then it's hopeless. Calling it a settlement is saying we're colonialists. We're saying we're colonialists. So if other people call us colonialists, then we've said it or called ourselves. Okay, last point. Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity are centrists. And if you think they're not, then you don't understand this country, period. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. I'll just make a couple quick things. I think that I think that we live in a complicated world, in a complicated country, and sometimes Israel is viewed as a complicated scenario. And so my view is the best way for unity and the best way for us all to be on the same page is to focus on the things that really do unite us. And even though I agree with some of your points, Richard, I think that what we want, what I'm as a Jewish Federation person want to do is to focus on the fact that there are critical elements that almost all of us agree with. And that is that Israel should be allowed to live as a free Jewish state, democratic Jewish state, and secure borders. And two, there's a whole bunch of the world that wants us dead. And when you know these things, I think it's a lot easier for us all to come together and to work side by side, even though, you know, there are certain issues that people are going to have difference of opinions on. I don't think it should impact the ability of the Jewish community to be able to work together and to support one another in the effort to keep America on the side of Israel and to make sure that America continues to support Israel.
Thank you. Thank you. Gloria, you had a question.
Gary, lest we go away with more hatred rather than less, what you said a few minutes ago about Jews being more hated or put upon or having more struggles with hatred than Black people, you put in a little caveat about for religious reasons.
Mhm.
And I have to think that that's very important because Black people can be many religions,
Yeah.
Baptist, event, many. I just want to check here. I mean, are you really telling us that Jews are more attacked or put upon or hated than Black people in this country?
No. Let me just go back to make it clear. When I was talking about there are different ways that the FBI statistics are kept. For religiously motivated, Black people not included in the religiously motivated, Gloria. So that, that's a totally different category. Jewish people Black people are thought to be, attacked or put upon, as you say, for racial or reasons of color. For the religious perspective, that's Catholics, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jews, Muslims. That's its own category. And in that category, of all of the religiously motivated crimes, again, this is not yelling something, or it's not necessarily just being, anti-Semitic or racist. For the actual crimes is the only thing the FBI records. Jewish people have 60% of all of those religiously motivated crimes. There are more black people who and I haven't seen this recently, so I don't want the tape to quote me on this, but there are more people who are Black people or prejudiced. Hate are prejudiced against Black people than Jewish people, and there are more Black people who suffer hate crimes than Jewish people. However, the actual Jew in this, based on the statistics, based on FBI statistics, there are fewer Jewish people than there are Black people, and Jewish people are more likely to experience hate crimes than others. Not as a total, but as an individual. So I'm just trying to point out that this is a real problem, and it's a growing problem.
Okay, we just don't want to encourage any sort of racism.
No,
because I understand what you're saying for religious reasons.
Right.
But that's an important part of it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question.
Ruth. You have to unmute. Unmute.
I'm going to ask you something really quite dumb, but for me, it's a source of confusion, and I think it's also in the world a source of confusion. How do we define Jewish people? Who is a Jew? When we say anti-racist in relation to Black people, Muslim people, even Asian people, there seems to be a consensus as to what we mean by race. But when it comes to a Jew, and to wit, for instance, the fact that we have to struggle with the idea that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right there is already something that has to be better defined.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to ask you very simply, how does the ADL define Jewish people?
So that's a big question. And that's not an easy answer, but I think I can sort of help with the problem that you're seeing from this. Jewish people are we have religious perspectives on what makes a Jewish person a Jewish person. but not everyone necessarily totally agrees with every one of those definitions. But I think from the perspective of your anti-Zionism issue, I think the Jewish community has some pretty clear issues to that. And I'll be very quick with this. I don't know if those of you, any of you are familiar with the 3Ds. The 3Ds is a series of definitions that was put together by Natan Sharansky. Remember, he used to be the Russian refusenik who's an Israeli minister. And this is the way that I think is the easiest way for us to determine anti-Semitism from some other opinion that we disagree with. In my view, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Right.
And the reason is because if you believe that the only state that doesn't deserve to exist is the only Jewish state in the world, case closed. People, and that is an easy thing that if we're not clear thinking about, for people to miss. No one has the right. You can be, if you believe no nation should exist, well, then Israel shouldn't exist too. But if you believe Palestine should exist, Iran should exist, France should exist, Pakistan should exist, but only Israel shouldn't. Over. So the second two parts, it's 3Ds. First, the delegitimization. That means Israel has no right to live. Second is double standard. If you criticize Israel for your perception of its bad acts, but don't criticize anyone else who does the same thing or worse, that's evidence of anti-Semitism too. The third one is demonization. When you compare Israeli actions to Nazism, apartheid, those kinds of definitive pieces of information which suggest there's no hope of recovery from, that is also anti-Semitism. Again, if you say nasty things, but use different language and you're trying to correct a problem or trying to weigh in on a problem, it doesn't have to be anti-Semitism. But the 3Ds are the way that I look. And I mentioned the IRA definition of the International Human Rights Alliance. That definition, one of its benefits, doesn't use the 3Ds in the same way, but it makes it very clear to people who don't understand that certain kinds of criticism of Israel is absolutely anti-Semitism. So, yeah, I could give a whole nother talk about the 3Ds, but delegitimization, demonization, and double standard. Those are all evidence of anti-Semitism if you treat Israel differently from everyone else.
Thank you. Robert.
No?
Yeah, thanks. You know, this is obviously complicated. Mr. Putin doesn't think that Ukraine has a right to exist.
Right.
Let me turn the question around.
And he calls them Nazis. He calls them a Nazi regime too. A big irony with the fact that there's a Jewish president. So that's
Absolutely. Is it possible to be an ardent supporter of Israel and anti-Semitic at the same time?
Well, that's a great question. I never really thought of it that way, but I would suppose yes. I mean, if you thought that Israel, should live, but had a nasty perspectives about Jews generally, I would say absolutely you could. In fact, there may be some people, although not too many. It's one of the things that's really interesting in my experience. Hatred of Jews can bring diverse people who otherwise hate one another together. And I'll give you an example. Iran regularly holds these sessions in which they put together people come from the world to meet to do Holocaust denial writing, sometimes comics, sometimes cartoons, sometimes writing. Right-wing haters of Jews have been known to attend that along with Islamic extremists. So hatred can be a very, it can be something that brings people together. So I suppose, in thinking of that as an example, yes, I suppose the answer would be, although I don't know of a lot of examples, but you certainly could be a hater of Jews but have some other reason to think that it's good that Israel exists. I can't imagine what it is, but I think it could be.
Right, I wouldn't.
Well, one of the reasons could be that, it would be a great idea if all the Jews just went to Israel. Remember that this existed in the United States when there was a great move to try to get all the Africans to go back to Africa.
Right.
In fact, that's where Liberia was set up.
Right.
And I would say that, what we have experienced is someone who said there are good people on both sides when there were people marching through Charlottesville saying we will not be replaced.
Right.
And in fact, I think just as mentioned, of course, that anti-Semitism existed for nearly 2,000 years before the state of Israel.
Yes.
So it's a big picture, but ultimately it comes down to the normalization of hatred. And what we experienced in the last 5 or 6 years has been the normalization of hatred amongst groups in this country. And anytime you do that, it's going to be the groups like us who are going to suffer.
Yeah.
I think it also should be said that fortunately, we still, there's a problem driving while Black. Fortunately, we still don't have a problem driving while Jewish. And I think there's a lot going on here. And I think we have to be very careful not to have litmus tests and to try to recognize that really what is central to all of this is the normalization of hatred.
Yeah, and as I said,
Excuse me. I just want to correct Rob's very inaccurate and
You're Richard, you're muted.
mute me. So
It's probably just as well I can't hear what Richard's saying.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else has any other questions.
I have one question, Lois.
Who is that?
Me, Bryna.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Gary, I just was wondering what you see as the future of anti-Semitism and the feelings toward Israel. It seems to me that Jews need to come together first and foremost and not criticize Israel. They don't live there. Israel has the right to govern themselves and decide what to do with the Palestinian situation. It seems to me we should leave them alone and let them govern themselves. And we need a lot more education to take place, especially from the federations across the country, to come together and let people know how the democracy exists in Israel and the good they do for the world, and how Jewish people have stepped forward and help each other. And I think we need to emphasize what's positive about our vision and Israel. And I'm wondering if you can address that. And I don't want to see anything happen negative in Israel. I have family there, etc. I'm wondering how you felt about that.
Well, listen, we have real challenges in Israel. We have, Iran, who's really working hard to become a nuclear nation, and they're very clear that they want to destroy Israel. And getting back to Robert's point a little bit too, I mean, we historically Zionism has been an effort to preserve the Jewish people, and now you worry that with so much hate there, and that we're making it easier to put a lot of us in a small place easier to hurt us. So we have a lot to worry about. Israel has a lot to be proud of. As I said, it's a thriving democracy. Arabs are part of its government. Israeli Arabs have more rights in Israel than any other Muslim citizen in virtually any other country.
Exactly.
There is a good newsletter about Israel that, Lois, maybe I'll see if I can dig that up and send it to you. And just following up on Bryna's point, what this does is it just reminds us of all the technology and all of the good that it does for the world, totally unrelated to the conflict. But I do think that we as a Jewish community, we are, but I think we need to be more engaged in making sure that people treat Israel fairly and let them know, our leaders and others, that we continue to care and we see our future very much tied in with the safety and security of the Jewish state. And I, the one final point I'll make, I personally don't have trouble with being critical of people that we love and people that we support. Israel can't, they can't be perfect any more than I can be perfect. And I think it's okay to say that. But as I said, it all starts from the foundation of knowing that Israel needs to be protected. It needs the support of the United States, and it deserves the support of the United States. And once we get that together, I think, as I said, I don't have any trouble with saying, hey, you screwed up here. We hate that policy, or that wasn't fair, or I think criticism and discussion with people that you love and you support is something that we don't need to shy away from, so long as we always make sure that we love and support, and we do our job is to make sure that other people love and support.
Thank you. And is there anybody else? Okay, I have one last question then. Do you think it is Judaism as a whole and Jews, or different sects of Judaism? I know I've heard very negatives about the Hasidim, Hamas, and I go on. And, I have friends living in different areas, and those two seem to be what people talk about negatively as Jews.
Yeah. So, my feeling is that we have enough people who hate us, some of whom are always engaged in the effort to destroy us, that I think it's incumbent upon us to really work hard, to work together and to support one another, even if we don't agree with everything, even if we're not on the same side of every issue. And I think that as a Jewish community, our job is to stand up for all of us, everyone else too, as we talked about with the tests of Hillel. But I think we should focus less on disunity and focus more on unity. And I think we have the basis for doing that. In Waterbury, just so you know, there is a growing group of Orthodox folks, very, very observant folks, who are in Waterbury and have, in fact, a yeshiva with 600 kids in it now. And I can tell you that certainly they have some different perspectives than we do in certain areas, but they're really making great efforts to be part of the Jewish community and to support the Jewish community. And so in my experience here, I think we have a lot to be thankful for in terms of that community being in town. Waterbury, the city itself, is overjoyed because it's sort of establishing a sort of helping some of the existing neighborhoods that have been deteriorating. So, again, not to say everyone has to like everything about everybody, but I think we have enough issues that our job is to work on unity and to work on mutual respect and to really save our ammunition for the bigger picture issues that we have to deal with, from problems we're experiencing in college campuses, the problems with the growing hate. As Robert said, it's not only focusing on us, but very often we are the principal source of the bad news. Again, you listen to the replacement theorists. We're the ones that control all the other people. So enough there to worry about that. I'd like us to spend a little less time worrying about internal differences.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm glad you're optimistic, and I think that you should continue with your optimism because it helps all of us. So
Lois,
thank you.
Thank you, Lois.
Yes, Richard. Okay. All right, I have some future programs. Gary, I thank you again, and we appreciated all the information you've given us. And if you just stay with us just a second, so I can talk about the future programs. Friday.
excuse me, Lois, I just want to correct a blatantly inaccurate statement that was made. And that is when it was said that there are good and bad people on both sides after Charlottesville. That's exactly what was not said. What was said was that, and the speaker said, not the speaker here, but we know who made that statement, said, except for Nazis, neo-Nazis, there are good and bad people from both sides. So the person in our group who said that distorted the record, and the whole liberal press has been distorting that point over and over again. He did not say, the president did not say there are good and bad people on both sides. He said, except for neo-Nazis, there are good and bad people on both sides. So
Well, I never heard that, so, but thank you. Thank you.
fact check, all of you.
Thank you, Gary, again. And future programs, Friday, June 3rd at 5:30, there'll be a Shabbat. With the coalition, we'll gather for Shabbat and talk about what it means to receive revelation, how the Israelites experience receiving Torah, and how we continue to create new methods of Torah study. There'll be some TikTok videos, so don't miss that. That's going to be fun. At 10 a.m. on Sunday, June 12th, we have our annual meeting. It will be virtual. You'll get more details on that. And on Thursday, June 16th, 5 o'clock, you'll get more details. Part 2 of the philosophy of aging. It will be called Spiritual Aspects of Grief and Mourning. And thank you for some of you that have suggested this, because I would not have put it in a part 2, but so many members wanted it. So there you have it. Just give us suggestions. We'll try our best to get it to you. Thank you. Have a great Sunday. Thank you all for coming from outside the coalition. Please join us again. From inside the coalition, have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lois.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Lois, thank you.